Hi, today we're going to be talking about ancient Rome. Ancient Rome is a culture that followed the Greek civilization and is going to be very much influenced by what the Greeks had established earlier. In fact, we use the term classical, C-L-A, capital C, classical, to describe the art of Greece and Rome because their cultures in many ways were so similar. And the reason for this is because the Greeks were such a huge influence on the Romans. And the Romans are going to adapt or adopt a lot of Greek ideas. They're going to adapt and adopt a lot of Greek cultural influence. The Roman religion was very much influenced by the Greek religion. Roman architecture and art was heavily influenced by Greek architecture and art, and even the Roman form of government, republicanism, where people have elected representatives who represent their interest, was derived from the Athenian Greek concept of democracy. It is, basically still based in the humanist principles that man has the right to rule ourselves. But instead of a direct democracy like the Athenians had, the Romans had elected officials. Very much like our country, the United States, today. We live in a republic where we have representatives who represent the interest of their constituents. Here's Rome at its height. Now, Rome is a massive empire, so this is very different from Greece that we saw earlier, which remained a tiny peninsula, and it wasn't until Alexander the Great came really after the height of Greek culture and spread Greek culture throughout the world. But Roman culture spreads through the Roman Empire. And at its height, this is a culture that spread from Scotland to Baghdad, guys. It is a huge population with millions of people. And there were also major cities within the boundaries of Rome itself, not just the city of Rome, but there were large cities containing hundreds of thousands of people at the height of Roman culture. In fact, Rome itself contained, over 1 million people at its largest. So these are massive cities, and so what we're going to see is the Romans are going to become incredible engineers because they have to build large-scale structures within their cities. Things like roads, things like sports arenas, things like shopping malls, things like large-scale public buildings to service these massive populations. One thing I want to talk about before I go on really quickly is I do want to refer to this banner here, the SPQR, the Senatus Populusque Romanus, which means the Senate and the Roman people. The Romans took great pride in the fact that they were a republic and that the citizen of Rome took great pride in being a citizen of Rome and having a government that represented them. So even the soldiers marched under the banner. When they marched under the banner of Rome, they actually marched under the banner of the Senate, which represented the people of Rome. So whenever in old movies you see that SPQR, that's what it means, the Senate and the Roman people. So Rome is actually divided into 3 sort of major historical eras, though. The earliest era was Rome ruled by the Etruscans. So the Etruscans are going to be the other major influence on Roman art next to the Greeks. Rome was part of the Etruscan lands and ruled by an Etruscan king until the 6th century when the final Etruscan king was deposed. And then Rome becomes a senate, a republic with an elected senate after that. And that is going to remain until the 1st century, around the 1st century AD, when Rome will become an empire, and that's when it will really spread its borders. This map that you're seeing here is Rome at its height during its empire, when it was absolutely huge. But Rome was in this constant state of sort of growth in flux before that. This is a sort of recreation of the city of Rome itself. You don't have to know all of these buildings. We will be looking at a lot of them, but I just wanted to give you an idea of sort of the major monuments, and also just to see what Rome looked like. Because Rome was a huge, densely populated city, and Roman, what we will see is Roman engineering will become the cornerstone, literally, on which Rome is built. We'll see that the Romans borrow heavily in terms of art and architecture from the Etruscans, and especially the Greeks. And while you will certainly see the influence of those two cultures in Greek and Roman stuff, the Roman engineers were able to build especially architecture and public architecture on a scale that the Greeks could never dream of. Because the Romans had to take care of these large populations, and they had to build these large buildings, and so they became very, very good at designing materials and methods of construction to create massive structures. So Rome has always been influenced by the Etruscans and the Greeks because of proximity. If we go back to our map here, of course you can see, Rome was right next to Etruria. It was associated with the Etruscans. It was under Etruscan rule, and there will be an Etruscan influence. Also, there were Greek colonies in Italy, and Greek culture for a period dominated the Mediterranean area. So there will always be a Greek influence. But this Greek influence becomes sort of souped up, if you will, because in the year 2011 BCE, a general named Marcus Marcellus conquers the Greek city of Syracuse, and he brings back a bunch of Greek stuff, a bunch of Greek art, a bunch of Greek writings, a bunch of Greek philosophy, a bunch of Greek everything. And this kind of brings a craze to Rome for anything sort of Greek. And the Roman culture is very much influenced by the Greek culture and art and architecture, and this really explodes after this conquering of Syracuse. And even the great Roman historian Livy says that there was a craze for works of Greece. Okay, so let's look at some Roman stuff. So what we have here is a small temple located in Rome, dedicated to the god Portunus, a god of harbors. We, of course, get the word port from this. And if you look at this temple, you can see that it is should look very familiar. It is a temple that utilizes a Greek pediment. It uses Greek Ionic columns, but there's also a big Etruscan influence here. Let's compare side by side. If you look at the Etruscan influence, you can certainly see, and of course we know the Etruscans also had some Greek influence, but you can see the use of a pediment. Also the fact that this is not a peripteral or peristyle structure like a Greek temple would be, but it's a more typical Etruscan structure where you have sort of a stair step leading up only to one side, the front of the building. Then you have a little porch area with columns supporting the roof. And it is basically a small closed-off rectangle that can only be entered from one side, like an Etruscan building. But it's like a Greek temple in the fact that it's made from marble, in the fact that it uses Greek Ionic capitals, but also, even though it is not a peripteral or peristyle temple, meaning it has a colonnade all around it, it has a fake column all around it. It has what we call an engaged column, columns that are halfway embedded into the wall, giving it a sort of faux peripteral kind of a view or look here. So very much, this is very Roman in a way. Romans were sort of thieves when it came to their influence. They kind of took from whatever worked, and the big influences, of course, being the Greece and the Etruscans, and this looks like pretty much a mashup of Greek and Etruscan art. It's also lacking, I forgot to mention, the statuary on the roof line that we see common to Etruscan art. Let's look at a temple slash, well, marketplace, really. This is the sanctuary of Fortuna Primigenia. This is the goddess of luck. This is in Palestrina, Italy. This comes from the late 2nd century BCE. And this is a remarkable example of early Roman civic architecture, architecture that is meant to serve a whole lot of people. This is a huge temple complex. That's not just a temple, but it's basically like a shopping mall slash theater slash temple. And the Romans, this kind of place would have attracted a huge crowds of people. And so one of the things the Romans got really good at, beyond just building big stuff, my cat is yelling at me. She wants to teach this class with me, so here she is. This is Astrid. We're going to talk about Rome today. Are you ready? Okay. So the Romans became really, really good at handling large crowds of people. Think of like a Disneyland or a theme park where you have massive crowds of people and you have to direct where they go. So this is built into a hillside, and the structure is designed with a series of ramps and stairways to sort of guide people and their experience as they enter this temple slash shopping mall here. And you can see the rather complex layout of this structure. But this is something we will often see in Roman art, especially our architecture. Large civic architecture is a sort of a design aesthetic that directs traffic and deals exclusively with sort of crowd control and managing large crowds. You'll also notice that the walls of this are something very common that you will see in of the Fortuna Primigenia. Something common that you'll see in Roman Republican art, and that is a technique called Opus Incertum, or inserted work. So Romans would often use concrete as a base, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, for their structures, or they would use a brick structure and then cover it with concrete, and then they would embed stones or pebbles into the concrete walls to create this sort of textural effect. The Opus Incertum is what it's called. It's inserted pebbles into a wall. And this is something that is specifically and kind of intrinsically Roman, that you don't see in Greek architecture or the architecture of the Etruscans. This is very much a Greek thing. But anyway, you can take a look at this complex. We're not going to get into sort of everything here and break it down, but you can see that most of the shops would have been located at these sort of ramps and stairway area at the lower part, and then there's this sort of Grand Plaza with a theater, and then the temple to this goddess is at the very top. So the Romans, in their construction, one of the things that made Roman buildings so strong and so powerful and able to withstand such heavy weights was the use of the arch. Now, if you look in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you should be familiar with this little architectural device. This is called a post and lintel, right? And it's two uprights with a crossbeam. And a post and lintel is perfectly serviceable. It had been in use, well, since the Neolithic era, and many structures built throughout the world use this system, and we've seen it a ton already in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek architecture. And here's the problem with it, though. Okay, so here's your, let me see if I can do this balancing act. Here's a post and lintel, but the problem is if you put too much weight on top of it, in the middle, it eventually will bend or even break. And that meant that depending on what kind of stone you were using, there was a limit to how tall you could make a building, because the taller the building, the more material, the more mass, the more weight, goes kaboom, right? Doesn't work. So what the Romans used instead was an arch. Now, they certainly didn't invent the arch, but the Romans used the arch in a structural way that no culture really before them had used. They sort of used the arch and variations of the arch throughout most or a good majority of their major architectural works. So what makes an arch so awesome? Well, let me show you. So as you'll notice from your screen, the arch is made up of a series of small trapezoidal cut stones called a voussoir. And voussoir, if you want to be fancy and French about it. And then the central voussoir is called the keystone. And this keystone does a lot of work. So what happens is, as any pressure comes directly down from the building above, it presses onto the keystone in these voussoirs. But instead of the pressure continuing straight downwards and leading into collapse, what happens to the weight is that it's distributed along the length or along the arch, and so it's a lot stronger than a simple post and lintel system, which means you could make taller buildings. And the Romans developed the arch into a bunch of different other architectural elements that allowed them to build huge structures. So they realized you could take an arch and you could sort of stretch it out long ways, and like on your upper left-hand image here, create what's called a barrel vault, because it looks like a barrel cut in half and put on its side. Or you could interconnect or intersect those. My cat is biting me as I'm lecturing. Intersect those groin vaults and form, or intersect those barrel vaults and form what is called a groin vault. A groin vault is an intersection of vaults. A groin is an intersection. That's why the place where your torso and your legs meet on your body is called your groin. Or we could have a fenestrated groin with what are known as clerestory windows, C-L-E-R-E-S-T-O-R-Y, windows that allow in light. Fenestrated is just a fancy word for it has windows. Or you could take an arch and sort of spin it around 360 degrees and create a dome. But all of these structures basically are based on the same sort of principle of the arch. That the pressure is pushed outwards and downwards, or what is known as sublimated, down the length of the arch, or in the case over here on the right, a dome. Okay, pretty cool stuff, right? So let's look at some Roman Republican era sculpture. So the image on the left, immediately you should be thinking, well, that looks pretty darn Greek. And yes, it does, doesn't it? We've already talked about this in chapter 5, looking at Greek stuff, and talking about how the Romans would often make copies of Greek sculptures, whereas the original Greek sculptures were often made using bronze. Romans often copied their sculptures in stone, using marble. Now, these were often painted too, though not always. And certainly there's some other similarities here too. Besides simply straight up copying Greek sculpture, the Romans adapted this sort of realism and naturalism that we find in Greek art. They also paid very close attention to the sculpting of fabric. And we don't get quite that wet drapery look, but we get something very close here to ancient Greek, the way the ancient Greek sculptures handle fabric. But what's different is the lack of idealism. Classical Greek sculpture, as you guys remember, is all about the ideal, and it's about the human body, representing the human body in a way that is glorifying it, in a way that represent it at its most perfect sort of state. So that's why classical Greek sculpture, everybody's like really built and buff and swole and standing around naked, because they want to show off this potential for this awesome great human body that we all have. But in Roman art, we see something rather different, at least in the faces. We don't usually see idealized faces, but instead we see realistic portraits of people. There's a word for this kind of truthfulness, and it's called verism, and it literally just means truthfulness. We get the word verify and veracity from the same root. Truthfulness. And a lot of this comes from the fact that the Romans were trying very often in their sculptures to portray historical figures or important family members. For the Romans, the sort of ancestor worship is incredibly important to their worldview and their religious beliefs. And there was a deep pride in families and family lines and the patricians, in other words, the fathers, the sort of these families. And in fact, there were several holidays that the Romans celebrated where they would take out sculptures of their ancestors and they would parade them around. And that's what this is happening here in this image. This is not a sculpture of a man carrying two severed heads. That would be weird. But instead it is a sculpture of a man carrying two busts of his ancestors as a way of honoring them. This was, as I said, very important to Roman culture and a part of sort of Roman pride. So there's a truthfulness here in the sculpture because the Romans wanted to capture what their ancestors looked like for posterity, to honor that person as they really looked. And so we get a realism, a verism, if you will, that we don't see in Greek art, Greek classical art. Now in Hellenistic, of course, we do see older people, but that's not Greek, that's Hellenistic, Greek influenced art. But what we are seeing here is a truthfulness that is often lacking in Greek classical art. Now, the image on the left is rather interesting. This is a portrait of a Roman general, but and it has been broken, and so we have to kind of reassemble it in our minds. My apologies for yawning. But if we look at the man's face, which is very truthful, he looks like an older man, a man in his late middle age, perhaps. But if you look at his body, he has the body of a young Greek athlete. So this is rather kind of funny to me, but that Roman truthfulness or verism stopped right about here at the neck. So it's like very realistic, not so much, right? It's like an old man who's just like working out at the gym all the time, and so he still has old man head, but he like comes, body is totally buff, right? Anyway, let me do this. If we look at the image of the guy on the right, you can see, once again, that verism I was talking about. And Roman sculptors became really, really good at portraying sort of all of the different features of the human face, and wrinkles, and all the blemishes, and all the sorts of inconsistencies of the human face. And I really believe like they reached a level of realism and truthfulness in their depiction of the human face that really surpassed anybody, any other culture, really, in the ancient world. But the basic idea of realism, of course, came from the Greeks, and then, of course, we also saw that briefly in the Egyptian Amarna period. We see more portraits here. This is really the first Roman coin to use a portrait of the emperor, or of a ruler, I should say, on the coinage. This desire to sort of advertise their ancestry sort of led to this, and this was Caesar was the first living ruler to have his own face on coinage. But this very much comes from this Roman portrait tradition with its ancestor worship and this interest in the family lines and patricians that came before. This is yet another veristic Roman head. This is of the ruler Pompey the Great. And you can see not only is it capturing, Romans were interested in sort of capturing the physicality of the face, but also they were interested in capturing sort of the personality of the face. And we can certainly see that truthfulness here. We can see almost a kind of arrogance in Pompey's face. We can see also a kind of a confidence, I guess, in that face as well. So they're really interested. This veracity, this verism, goes fairly deep here. The Romans kept slaves. It is a huge part of Roman culture. By the end of the Republican period, there was something like 2 million slaves within the boundaries of Rome, not just the city of Rome. 2 million is not even the population of Rome itself, but within a Roman lands. And slavery was an important, although tragically sad, aspect of Roman society. Romans often, slaves could come from conquest. Slaves could also be people coming from people who sold themselves into slavery to pay off debts. Slavery could be for a set amount of time, or it could be for a person's lifetime. One generally could buy one's own freedom from slavery, but typically slaves kept their former masters' names, and that's what we're seeing here. This is the art of former slaves, but they kept the name of their former owner, their former master. So Publius Gessius is the original owner, and even though these men bought their freedom, Gessius Primus and Gessius Fausta, noticed they adopted as their first names the last name of their former owner. And so, you know, when we look back at past societies, it can be very difficult because oftentimes the practices of those societies are diametrically opposed ethically and morally to the standards by which we live today. And it is hard for us to be, it's easier for us to get maybe confused or to feel anger or sadness towards these kinds of developments, and certainly it's something we need to, you know, I'm not saying not to feel this way at all, but we also need to, you know, look at history with an eye for, well, using this word verism, of truthfulness, and we can't gloss over some of the more horrific aspects of past societies. We have to accept them. We have to not accept them as in that they're good, but we have to accept that they existed, and we have to understand them within their context. That doesn't mean we have to like them, but certainly Romans practiced slavery, and there's all sorts of art that references this. But once again, the portrait was really important in Roman culture, wasn't it? Because this idea of recording for posterity your face meant that it would be passed on by future generations as a way of honoring you. So slaves could not make portraits of their ancestors, but many freed slaves, after being freed, did. And oftentimes these were for funeral markers. So the image we just saw, let's go back here, is a funerary relief. It is a gravestone. And the same here in this image of this funerary procession. So slaves could often, freed slaves then would often make images. Moving on, let's now move into the imperial period, or the time of empire. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the events that lead up to that yet. We'll get to that shortly in the next video. But around the 1st century, Rome moves from a republic to an empire, meaning they now have an emperor. They're still going to have their senate, but we are going to start to see some changes artistically in this period. But what I want to look at first is the city of Pompeii, because it is, of course, in Pompeii. In 79 AD, the volcano, this Mount Vesuvius, erupted, leaving the city completely buried in layer after layer of ash. Now, while this was a tragic, horrific event, it is important for historical excavations because the city was left almost completely intact underneath this layer of ash. And so in the 18th century, we start to see these excavations really kick into full gear. And we start to really discover a lot about what ancient Rome looked like. And so even though we are technically in the imperial period, it's very early in the imperial period. So a lot of the art is going to sort of resemble what was going on when Rome was still a republic. So it's a transitionary period. But the image that you're seeing here are not statues, but rather these are bodies that were preserved and literally sort of turned into ash as the massive amount of ash from Mount Vesuvius decimated the town. People were literally stopped in their tracks. People were on the streets. We see there's people who were walking their dogs. There are people who were sitting down reading. There were, just people in their normal everyday activities who were just blanketed by this ash. And it preserved them, and it preserved the architecture around them. So as you can see from our map here, Pompeii is further south than Rome. Pompeii is a much smaller city than Rome, and it was in many ways used as kind of a vacation spot for our wealthier Romans, or a place where some Romans would go to retire. And it is very much a kind of provincial, not huge urban sort of area. And so the art and architecture from Pompeii isn't going to be as grand or as large as the architecture and art as we will see in Rome. But what makes it so significant is how well preserved it was. So this is because Rome, Rome is a city that's been, occupied and, inhabited for, since its creation. And so, Rome has changed and grown, and old buildings have been torn down and added onto. And so there's very few Roman buildings that are preserved in their original state. Pompeii is like a snapshot, a historical snapshot that allows us to see what Roman art and architecture was like at the late Republican, early imperial period. Okay, so here is a quick overview of the Forum of Pompeii. Forum is the literal center, both political, religious, and oftentimes physical center of the town. Think of, in small Texas towns, the town square. And the forum usually included the forum, which was this large public meeting area. It also, and a place for a marketplace. It included a temple. In this case, we have a temple to the main god Jupiter, and then a basilica. A basilica is another large-scale sort of public building. And we'll talk about basilicas a little later on in this chapter and into the next chapter. One of the main structures built in Pompeii is the amphitheater, which literally means double theater. Remember, the Greek theaters were basically half a circle, and this had to do with the fact that Greek technology, architectural technology, wasn't strong enough to hold up a sort of double-sided theater, and Greeks literally built their structures into the side of a hill, so the hill could support the sort of half bowl shape of the theater. But amphitheater, amphi meaning literally double or twice, so to amplify something literally means to double its volume. That's what it literally means, not actually means, but that's where the root comes from. Amphi means to double. So an amphitheater is literally a double theater. Now, we'll see some amphitheaters later on that were built purely of concrete, and we'll talk about that. But the theater in Pompeii was made by piling up dirt to create basically like an earthen bowl, and then the structure could be built inside of that. This bowl supported what were then the seats, the cavea they were called, and the wedge-shaped sections that divided up the seats called the cuneus. The exits and entrances were stairs and what were called vomitoria. A vomitoria is literally just an opening. It's a doorway. It's a channel for people to pass in and out. And it's, of course, where we get the word vomit because, well, just as people exit through a vomitorium, so does their food exit vomit. Conversation got lovely in here, didn't it? We do see concrete used to make the outer wall, but it's not going to be used in the structural way that we will see in later works in Rome itself. The outer wall of Pompeii is created by what's called a blind arcade. So a row of arches, of which we see a lot in Rome because these are very strong structures that arches, as you know, can support a lot of weight. A row of arches is called an arcade. A row of arches that lead nowhere, that basically are there just for decorative purposes, are called blind arcades. Okay, moving on. So sporting events were held in these amphitheaters, and that is the same thing that happened in Pompeii. We have a fresco from one of the walls at a house in Pompeii that depicts this structure, the amphitheater at Pompeii. What's fascinating, though, is that it depicts a very famous event. A huge brawl broke out during a sporting event, and between Pompeii and a sort of rival town, rival people called the Nucerians, and this led to a huge brawl that was so bad, actually, that it led to a 10-year ban on games. If you look at the very top of this image, you can see there's this large cloth. This is called a velarium, and the velarium could be sort of pulled over the top of the Colosseum to provide shade. And this is a Colosseum that held 20,000 people, so this is a really big piece of fabric that would have been hauled out to protect these people. But if you really want to start to understand the significance and the importance and the sort of amazing quality, really, of Roman engineering, Pompeii is a pretty good place to start, because this sort of kind of engineering marvel wouldn't really, the Egyptians couldn't have built this, the Greeks couldn't have built this, but the Romans certainly did. Let's look at some Roman houses, some Roman architecture. Now, these kinds of houses weren't common in the city of Rome itself. Rome was much too densely populated, so most people in the city of Rome lived in apartments. We'll look at some of those in a moment, or next chapter. Insulae, they were called. But they were apartments, basically. 2, 3, 4-story apartments. But what we see in smaller towns are, well, homes or houses. And this is a kind of a typical late Republican, early Imperial house. Not only were these places where people lived, but these were also often businesses. The front rooms of the house often housed businesses. Sometimes businesses run by the family, or sometimes these spaces were rented out to other individuals. But this is sort of your basic Roman house. You have the entryway, the Fauces, or what's called the throat of the house. You have this sort of central meeting area called the Atrium, with a basin, a water basin that provided water for use by the household, the Impluvium, and then there were little cubiculum off to the sides, and these were bedrooms. And then you had a place for ancestor shrines, because remember, this is a big part of Roman life, with the Fauces, the ala along here, and then you have an office area, the tabulum, you have a dining room, and then you have an outdoor sort of garden area referred to as the peristyle. And you guys know this word from ancient Greeks, peripteral or peristyle temples, and this means a colonnade around the perimeter of an area. Okay, so let's take a look inside. This is the house of the Veti, a very important, influential family in Pompeii. We know a lot about the architecture of this time because of a Roman writer and architect named Vitruvius. And Vitruvius is a guy whose name will pop up again later on this chapter. But he wrote a lot about the architecture of this time. So with the physical evidence of Pompeii and with the writings of Vitruvius, we know quite a bit. Here we are in the Fauces, the foyer of the building. This is the first room basically you walk into, and then right here after and then we look in the Fauces, then the Atrium. So we're standing in the Fauces looking in the Atrium, and then you can see the Impluvium here. This would have been, of course, filled with water. You can see there's a skylight overhead where water would come down and fill the basin here. You can also see that the basin is lined with marble. So you can also see off to the sides the various cubicula, the rooms. If we get to the very back of the house, this, of course, is here. This is the peristyle, and we can see that. And this is a very fancy house. This is a house of a very powerful family. So not all Pompeian houses would be like this, of course, but you can see we have this rather beautiful garden area with a colonnade, of course, around the perimeter, gives the name peristyle. So the walls of these houses were typically painted. These were frescoes. Frescoes, as you know, is a painting made with plaster. Basically, pigment is added, coloring is added to wet plaster, and then painted onto a wall. That's a very simplified version of what happens, but that's good enough for now. And this plaster adheres to the wall, and it can be very, very long lasting. I mean, here we are looking at a building that is 2,000 years old. So there are four major styles of painting that we find in Roman houses. And these really begin in sort of the late 2nd century BC, and we're going to be looking at Roman painting up until really the 1st century AD. So, around 200 years or so of Roman art. And just like modern day styles change, Roman styles changed. And so you're not going to have to know dates or anything like that, but I do want you to know these styles. I want you to be able to discern and determine and differentiate, I should say, these four styles, which are known as the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th style. So the first style is often referred sometimes as a masonry style, although I often call it the faux finish style. But basically what it is this. This is the first style, and if you look closely, you might be fooled at first that it looks like marble or granite or other kinds of stone. But this is actually a painting. This is a fresco painting that is made to look like these different kinds of materials. And this was very common in Roman art. And the first style, was a style that was used kind of throughout the history of Roman wall decoration and painting. But this is a really good example of it here. But you'll see walls that look like wood or marble or brick or whatever, and they were actually made with paint. This is what is known as the second style, which I call the illusionistic style. The second style was meant to create the illusion that we are looking at a scene of nature or a group of people or architecture, and it was painted in as realistic a manner as possible. And you can certainly see that in this room here. where we see these buildings painted on the wall and these sort of landscapes painted on the wall that give the illusion that you are looking into a garden or looking at a temple. Even the columns are painted on. These aren't actual columns, these Greek Corinthian style columns, but instead are painted. That is the second style. The second style was actually quite impressive in its realism, because the Romans started to develop something called linear, or sometimes called one-point perspective. This is an artistic technique that will become sort of perfected in the Italian Renaissance, but it's basically a mathematically precise way to create the illusion of realistic three-dimensional space. It's a mathematically precise way that creates a realistic illusion of three-dimensional space. And it's based on this idea that you have a horizon line and you have a point called the vanishing point. And then all of the objects appear to sort of meet at that vanishing point in the distance. And you've seen this illusion as you've driven down a very straight Texas road, and in the distance it looks like the road meets itself. Of course, you know that's not the case, that the road remains parallel, but as it gets further away it appears to meet upon itself. We are looking at a sort of small circular temple called a tholos. This is a little circular structure with a colonnade. These were common in urban Roman environments. This, of course, is not a real tholos, but a painting of one, painted in a rather illusionistic way. So it looks like we have a tholos sitting in a three-dimensional courtyard. But second style painting wasn't just relegated to images of architecture and landscapes, but also we see images of people. Now this is a rather complicated image. We're not going to get into it specifically because there's a lot going on here. This is a religious image. This is from another villa in Pompeii, and this is known as the Dionysian Mystery Frieze. What does that mean? So Dionysus is the Greek and Roman god of wine, although so we have Dionysus, and there was a whole sort of cult associated with Dionysus, or what was known as a mystery religion. And mystery religions started to pop up in the late Republican era of Rome, and these were often religions based in that came from the Middle East. And there were many different mystery religions, but the idea was that they sort of revolve around secret rites or secret practices or a secret kind of transformation that was basically a mystery that couldn't be sort of understood with sort of normal logic, but instead refer to something magical or mystical. One of these mystery religions that started to become popular at this time would have been Christianity. But here we are looking at a mystery religion based around Dionysus, and we are looking at a rite or a ceremony performed. What exactly that ceremony entailed, we're not really sure. There's not a lot of writings that still exist from this particular cult of Dionysus. But it certainly involves an initiation where people are being flogged or whipped. But what I want you to pay attention to, first of all, look at that Greek meander just sitting there looking all Greeky. That is a technical art historical term, Greeky. I hope you wrote that down. But that Greek influence, right? Never going to go away. That meander now is... well, it's about 800 years old, and it's still there. It still persists, right? But look at the figures here. Once again, we have that Greek verism. We have that Roman verism, I should say, that Roman realism. Although the figures do look a little stiff. One thing to kind of keep in mind is that we're out here sort of in the country a bit, and really most of your sort of top artists and craftsmen will be working in Rome itself, and sort of not out in the smaller provinces. But we don't have a lot of these Roman frescoes that survived within Rome itself. And so like so much of Pompeii, it gives us access to Roman art and architecture, intact Roman art and architecture, in a way that we wouldn't have, or we don't have. This is a rather interesting image. This is a gardenscape, and I'm sorry that let me move my little window here. This comes from Prima Porta, Italy. So this is not from Pompeii. This is from Prima Porta, but this is a wall that has survived. This was built in the villa of the Empress of Rome, a woman named Livia, who was married to Augustus. And what we see here is that once more that illusionistic second style. In this case, we see this rather beautiful garden. Also, you're going to see another kind of perspective called atmospheric perspective. An atmospheric perspective is a technique artists use to create the illusion of an atmosphere. And at its simplest, what that means is that objects that are really far away appear hazy. They appear less focused, and usually less bright, less intense in color. They usually appear dull. And the reason is because there is air between your eye and that object really far away. Now, at a short distance, an object appears clear because that air is more or less invisible. But if you get enough volume of air between you and whatever you're looking at, that air distorts whatever object it is you're seeing that's further away, and it appears hazy. And so you can see the artist is imitating that phenomenon, and they have utilized atmospheric perspective to create this illusion of depth. Okay. So let's take a look at the third style. This is much more decorative. It emphasizes the flatness of the wall. It is not illusionistic. This is like the opposite of the second style. And so here is a third style wall. This is a close-up of an image from the third style. But this is what the wall looked like. You'll notice it is... this also does not come from Pompeii, by the way. This was also made for a member of the emperor's family, probably his daughter, for a wedding. But what I want you to focus on is what the third style is. It's very decorative. It is almost abstract, although we see the use of columns here, but these are impossibly thin columns. But there's more of an emphasis on decoration. There's an emphasis on geometric forms and patterns. Sometimes we might see small sorts of images used in a decorative way within a third style painting, as you see as this little image here of this little villa architecture. But for the most part, the emphasis on third style is on patterns and geometry. It's very decorative. And then we have the final style, the fourth style. And I like to refer to this as the kitchen sink style. And I forgot to mention the third style, I usually just call the decorative style. But the fourth style, I like to call the kitchen sink style because it's a little bit of everything. This comes from Nero's palace, the Emperor Nero's palace in Rome. So once again, not from Pompeii. But these are, the few examples that we do have. But you'll notice it's a little bit of everything. We have like the sort of faux finish of the first style. We have the illusionism of the second style. We have the decorative geometric qualities of the third style, all thrown together into a kind of hodgepodge, a kitchen sink, a little bit of everything in here. That is the fourth style. And fourth style images often would, create sort of the large-scale illusionistic images of the second style, sort of put them in a frame, like a sort of a third style frame, as you can see here in this image from the Greek mythology, an image from the Ixion room, because this is a story from Greek mythology. Ixion tried to seduce the wife of Zeus, Hera, but Zeus punished him by binding him to a spinning wheel, and so that we see the spinning wheel over here. I always found that a little hypocritical, because Zeus pretty much slept with everybody and everything, and had tons of affairs, and had lots of illegitimate children, and this made Hera, his wife, mad all the time. And now Zeus is getting upset because some dude is trying to seduce her, and he's being a little bit of a hypocrite because he basically seduced everybody. Okay, moving on. Oh, but look at the realism here. Look at the three-dimensional quality of the figures. They are rather lifelike in their illusionism. We often also see in Roman art, decorative art, mosaics. M-O-S-A-I-C. A mosaic is an image. It can be a wall image or an image on the floor made up of little pieces of tile. And that is what we're seeing here. These are small little pieces of polished clay that are combined like sort of like a giant jigsaw puzzle to create an image. But what I really want to focus on here is this wonderful image from Pompeii. This comes from a house of a man who was probably a baker. He was young, he was newlywed, and what we are looking at here is a portrait. This comes from a much larger fourth style wall, so imagine a bunch of other things around it, but we're just focusing on this small little image within it. This shows this young man and his wife, relatively newly married, shown together in this sort of marital portrait. Now keep in mind that they would have probably been killed during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. You know, there's something really haunting about this image to me. Now, this young couple are basically, you know, yuppies. They're young urban professionals. They're up and coming. They're establishing themselves in the world, and they want to show off their money. They want to show off their wealth. They want to show off their education. And so we see the man holding a scroll, a sign of his education, a sign of his ability to read. Although he may or may not have been able to read, sometimes people were shown with writing implements and with the written word, even though they might have actually been illiterate, but it was a status symbol. And so he is showing that he has this sort of rolled up scroll here, and then his wife is holding a wax tablet known as a pugilare. Pugilare comes from the Latin word meaning fist, and you might have heard of a boxer referred to as a pugilist, and this is where we get the word. Pugilare means fist, but this is also used to describe a tablet that was held in the fist. And these were wax tablets, and so these were usually made from wood with a layer of wax inside of it. And then a student could take the stylus, the writing instrument, and scratch the writing into the wax tablet. So this is like the early smartphone, I guess. So what we are seeing is an image that is, these people are really trying to show that they are educated, that they are urbane, that they are sort of up and coming in the world. It's a haunting image, knowing that they probably were buried under tons and tons of ash. We don't know exactly when this was made, somewhere between 70 to 79, obviously, AD in Pompeii. This kind of image of sort of showing a young person as being educated is very common among the middle and upper classes in Pompeii as a way of showing status, or not just Pompeii, but in Rome, I should say. Here we have yet another image of a pugilare and the stylus. And I love how in both of these images, she's showing they look very contemplative. They look like they're really thinking about something deep and important. This is that Roman verism, right? That need to kind of capture not only the way people look, but also their personalities. I just love these portraits. I also like the fact that, this guy has kind of big ears, and the artist is not really trying to hide those at all, because truthfulness is so important in Roman art. But this tradition actually comes from images of poets. There was a whole tradition that actually started in Greece of portraits, of seated portraits of poets. And here we see an image of a poet named Meander sitting in a chair holding his work, showing that he is an educated man, a man of letters. So this was a big influence on these kinds of portraits in the Roman culture. But also, and I'm just sort of planting a seed here, these author portraits will have a big influence in the Middle Ages when we start to see the depictions of the writers of the Gospels of the New Testament. And we're going to see early Christians borrow this image of the author portrait and use it to depict the Gospel writers of the Bible. This image I find absolutely fascinating also. The Romans really were starting to experiment with painting in a way to make it look as realistic as possible, to make it look as illusionistic as possible. And they would create these paintings that attempted to be something we call a trompe-l'oeil, or a fool the eye. That's what it means in French, trompe-l'oeil. I know it looks like trompe-l'oeil, but it's trompe-l'oeil. And it literally means fool the eye. But it's this technique, to create illusionistic images. So, the idea was that, you could paint an apple so real that people would think it was a real apple. And what's really amazing here is this image of water. This is, to my knowledge, the first real attempt of any artist to explore the qualities of light passing through water. And if we look over here at this leaf especially, you can see that it is shifted in the water because water refracts light. And you've all seen this phenomenon. You put a straw in water and it looks broken. Well, here we have an artist trying to replicate that phenomenon. I think Romans Romans more than the Greeks really tried to replicate the way the world really looked. They didn't quite get it right, because they were learning how to do it. But this verism, this truthfulness, really pushed their art to new heights in terms of realism. All right, so that's where we're going to stop for today. In the next lecture, we're going to really get into the Roman imperial period and look at the massive changes, not just politically and culturally, but of course artistically, that occurred during that period. All right, see you then.